All right, what's up, eighth grade? Today we're going to do chapter 4, section 2, or section 3 and 4. So today we're going to talk about how did slavery develop in the colonies and affect colonial life? Well, I'll tell you. Spanish and Portuguese settlers were the first to bring enslaved Africans to the Americas. Slavery spread to the colonies of other European countries where it became a regular part of trade and provided cheap labor to southern plantations. The British, Dutch, and French all entered the slave trade, and in time the English colonists, especially from New England, were actively shipping enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. There you can see the picture. More than 10 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas between the 1500s and the 1800s. Slave traders set up posts along the African coast, and Africans who lived on the coast made raids into the interior. They were looking for people to kidnap and sell to the Europeans. Half of those captives died on forced marches to the coast, some of which were as long as 300 miles. So they went in, kidnapped people, and made them march like 300 miles all the way to the coast. Once they arrived at the coast, captives were traded for guns and other goods. Then they were sent across the Atlantic Ocean on the brutal voyage known as the Middle Passage. And to increase their profits, some slave ship captains crammed the maximum number of captives on board. As a result of those terrible conditions, 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans died or committed suicide during the Middle Passage. So some of them, instead of being slaves, figured that it would be better just to commit suicide, and a lot of them did, which is terrible. I can't imagine. And as you can see, they're crammed in as tight as they can be packed. Some people even laying in the middle of the aisle. In the Americas, healthy enslaved Africans were auctioned off when they were sold, and families were often separated. About 500,000 enslaved Africans ended up in British North America. And as you can see, non-Spanish West Indies made up 41% of their destination. Crazy. By about 1700, slave traders in the British colonies had developed a regular routine known as triangular trade. The first leg, New Englanders traders sailed to the Caribbean islands where they traded fish and lumber for sugar and molasses. They sailed back to New England where they used the sugar to make rum. The New Englanders then sailed to West Africa where they traded rum and guns for slaves. And on the third leg, the New Englanders then sailed to the Caribbean islands where they traded slaves for more molasses. So they left up here, came down here, got rum, came back, made molasses, sailed all the way over here to trade molasses and rum for slaves, and then came all the way back and sold the slaves so they could buy more molasses. It was just a big circle. Although the triangular trade was illegal under the Navigation Acts, many New England merchants violated those rules because it made them very, very rich. And the first enslaved Africans in the colonies may have been treated as servants. Some were even eventually freed. But as the need for cheap labor grew, colonies made slavery permanent. Some colonists tried to ban slavery, but it eventually became legal in all of the colonies. Why did slavery take root in the colonies? The plantation system led the Southern economy to depend on slavery. Planters preferred slaves because while indentured servants were freed, after their terms were over, slaves were slaves for life. Not every African in America was a slave, but slavery came to be restricted to people of African descent. Slavery was then linked to racism. Most English colonists thought that they were superior to Africans, and they thought it was their duty to convert Africans to Christianity and European ways. There were so many slaves in the colonies that whites began to worry about slave revolts. The first serious slave revolt took place in 1663 in Gloucester, Virginia, and others soon followed. So, the colonial authorities wrote slave codes that said enslaved people could not meet in large groups or own weapons. They could not leave the plantation without permission. They could not learn to read and write. And slave codes also said that masters who killed their slaves could not be tried for murder. The new codes did not stop resistance. In 1739, 29 white colonists were killed during a slave revolt in South Carolina. And revolts continued to flare up until slavery itself ended in 1865. And the lives of enslaved Africans. In the North, only 10% of the enslaved population lived north of Maryland. Northern enslaved worked as blacksmiths, house servants, or farm laborers, and over time they might buy their freedom. On rice plantations in South Carolina, slaves kept the customs of West Africa. They made African grass baskets and spoke Gullah, a dialect that blended English and several African languages. African culture influenced American culture because craft workers in the cities used African styles of quilts, furniture, and other objects. African drums and banjos became part of music, and African folk tales became part of American culture. All right, now we're going to go to Chapter 4, Section 4. How did ideas about religion and government influence colonial life? Well, the Great Awakening, one of the first national movements in colonies, reinforced democratic ideas, and the Enlightenment informed colonists' ideas about the structure of government and the rights of citizens. Puritans passed laws that required towns of a certain size to open schools. These Massachusetts laws were the beginning of public schools in America, and Puritan schools were run with both private and public money. Puritan education laws were not completely compulsory. Some towns paid a fine rather than set up in a school. So towns of more than 50 had to have a school, but instead of building a school, some towns just decided to pay the fine. Laws that required all children to attend did not begin until the late 1800s. Colonial schools, religion. In the 1600s, most schools were under religious sponsorship, and they provided instruction in religion. Colonial elementary schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Children learned from hornbooks and from 1860s reading called the New England Primer. And in southern schools, there were few schools in the South, so the gentry often hired private tutors to teach their children. And poor children often received no formal education at all. Some girls attended colonial elementary schools while others went to dame schools. Most schools were restricted to white children, but one New York school taught free African Americans, Native Americans, and poor whites. Some Quaker and Anglican missionaries taught enslaved people to read, and after that was outlawed, some enslaved people taught themselves while others passed on their knowledge in secret. So unfortunately, there were very few education opportunities, and of the enslaved people that could read, most of them passed it on to their kids and other people in secret, because if we remember back to the slave codes, they could not learn to read or write, so it had to be done in secret. Higher education, grammar schools. Some boys went on to grammar schools, which prepared them for college. Grammar schools taught Greek, Latin, geography, mathematics, and English composition. In colleges, the first American colleges were founded largely to educate men for the ministry. Harvard was the first one in 1683, and the College of William and Mary in 1693. I'm sorry, did I say 1638? Whew. In 1693 was the first college in the South. And the earliest forms of colonial literature were sermons and histories. And Anne Bradstreet published a book of poetry in 1650, and Phillis Wheatley, an enslaved African in Boston, saw her first poem published in the 1760s. At age 17, the famous Benjamin Franklin started the Pennsylvania Gazette, which became the most widely read newspaper in the colonies. Guys, he started that at 17 years old. Some of you guys aren't far away from that age. Imagine starting your own newspaper. He also wrote the Poor Richard's Almanac from 1733 to 1753, which was and a vivid autobiography. Benjamin Franklin eventually became one of the founders of the United States. The Great Awakening. An emotion-packed Christian movement called the Great Awakening swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 40s. By the 1700s, religious rules had become less strict in many of the colonies. The Great Awakening began as a reaction against what some Christians saw as a decline in the religious zeal in the colonies. And Jonathan Edwards wrote a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. English minister George Whitefield made several tools for the colony. This Great Awakening led to more tolerance of religious differences in the colonies, and it led to the rise of many new churches such as the Methodist and Baptist, and the split of many churches such as the Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, and Congregational churches. Starting in the late 1600s, a group of European thinkers started an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. These thinkers believed all problems could be solved by human reason, and the Enlightenment reached its height in the mid-1700s in France. In 1690, an Englishman named John Locke published two influential works, two treatises on government, and in this work, Locke argued that people have certain inalienable natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Where does the right to govern come from? Well, some people believed in the divine right, which was from God, and others natural rights, which is from people. Where do people's rights come from? They come from the ruler under the divine right, and under natural rights, people believe that from God to the people. And what happens if a government violates the people's rights? Well, the idea of divine right says that people must obey the ruler, and natural right says people can change their government, which usually means a revolution. Locke wrote that people formed governments in order to protect their rights, and if a monarch violates those rights, the people have the right to overthrow that monarch. Boom. This idea would later shape the United States. A French thinker, Baron de Montesquieu, also influenced American ideas. In his book, The Spirit of the Laws, he argued for separation of powers in government. He said the separation of power keeps one person or group from gaining too much power. He suggested that it should be divided into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The division of power became the basis of government in the United States. That should sound pretty familiar, right? All right, guys. Now you need to go to Google Classroom and complete your worksheet. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.